Stay tuned for more information from Exodus 90 at the end of the video. Usually this time of year, a lot of people like to make recap videos where they're reviewing the year that is just coming up to an end. But I would like to take a little broader view of what's been going on, because we are coming up onto the first quarter of this century now coming to a close. And for honest people, there's a sense of cynicism and pessimism out there about the way that this century is shaping up. We were going into the turn of the century, and I remember this vividly, with a lot of optimism. But after we've gone 25 years into this new century, there's a lot of despair and a lot of concern around things like political polarization, political violence, a decrease in moral sensibilities and cultural solidarity. Education standards seem to be plummeting, and the younger generation seems to be really struggling to meet milestones that a lot of us just took for granted in the past. The economic prospects for young people today seem to be worse than ever. There are wars and really horrific wars that are taking place in the world right now. And so a lot of people are taking an inventory of all of this and saying to themselves, what's going on? What's causing all of this? And I think a major contributor to all of this, at least the sense of bewilderment that a lot of people are struggling with, is our lack of historical and philosophical fluency. And the main reason behind this is that we aren't taught philosophy, and certainly the history of philosophy, anymore. This is something that, 60 to 80 years ago, people would have taken for granted as part of their education. They would have learned dialectic and logic and debate and rhetoric and these sort of standard classical liberal concepts. But in our new progressive modern education, the focus shifted towards science and math, even though a lot of those concepts simply aren't employed in our day-to-day lives. I remember being in like grade 8 math class, and there was this poster on the wall that listed all the professions that you would need math for. And the list was so long and the font and typography was so small and fine that you could barely even read it, with the presumption in the message being math is so essential to your daily life. And the level of math that you're going to be learning as you move forward into high school, into college, is so essential that you have to focus this amount of energy on it. And the same goes for science. But in fact, how many people do you know that actually read scientific journals and keep up with the latest scientific research, unless that's their specialty? I don't know anybody that does that. So it's a specialized aspect of the professional fields that it caters to, and yet everybody is expected to devote significant amounts of their educational formation to learning these fairly advanced modes of science and mathematics. And this all came at the expense of learning philosophy. And yet, philosophical thought shapes our lives and shapes our history more than anything else. And in fact, that's probably a statement that's going to come as a surprise to a lot of people, because we're so ignorant of this fact. We don't appreciate the significant influence that it has. Take, for example, the eras that we live in. Right now, we're living in the postmodern era, right? What does that mean? What is postmodern? It's a philosophical movement, a philosophical school of thought. And it's so prominent in shaping our history and shaping our lives that we name this era of history that we are living through by that philosophical movement. And yet, how many people living in this moment of history could define what postmodernism is? What are the key ingredients of postmodernism? What about modernism that came right before that? What about liberalism and secular humanism and socialism and all these and Renaissance humanism and all these movements that preceded it? Most people have no idea, and yet this is a long succession of thought that shaped our history that is now leading up to this moment. Another key ingredient that philosophical and liberal arts education would have inoculated us against was sophistry. Sophistry is manipulative and persuasive communication, which is pretty much all advertising is. For example, advertising is like sophistry on steroids, where it's taking all the accessories of modern media and the persuasive techniques of psychology to manipulate us as effectively as possible in order to make us make decisions that we otherwise wouldn't make. This is baked into obviously conventional advertising to make us or to persuade us to buy things that we don't need, but also, especially in the tech sector, to psychologically manipulate us to compulsively use technology that we just don't actually need to use, and which has all kinds of deleterious effects on our personal lives and our psychology. I'm speaking especially about social media right now. And sophistry is used to great effect in the political sphere. Now, a proper grounding in good and sound philosophy, especially in fallacies, the common fallacies that are employed by sophistry, would protect us against falling prey to sophistry. But unfortunately, because we aren't educated in that, it gives those with the power and the money to use things like advertising and sophistry in their debate training for political gain. Like, all of our political leaders are extremely effective sophists. If you pay attention to like a presidential debate, for example, all it is sophistry, and people are cheering on for their guy who's the most effective, or woman for that matter, who's the most effective sophist. But if we were properly grounded in a philosophical training and education, we would be able to see through that and detect it and not fall prey to it. So if we're wondering why political corruption and political violence and political polarization are probably the best ways to describe the power politics of our current age, sophistry has a lot to do it, and our own inability to detect it and to see through it and to understand the difference between sound and fallacious arguments has a lot to do with where we find ourselves politically today. But the key thing that stands out for me is the role of the church in shaping our history, which is conspicuously absent from our typical and the general imagination of how our history is shaped, especially because so many people ground their history in movies and things like that they've seen. So think of movies, historical movies, very popular and influential ones, like something like Amadeus, which is the biography of Mozart, or a sort of biographical film about Mozart. You have obviously characters who fill roles like artists and composers and courtiers and emperors and nobility, but where is the church in that movie? Where is the role of bishops and clergy and theologians? They're conspicuously just not there, even though they played a fundamentally key role in shaping the life of that era and the culture around it. How about a movie like Braveheart, which sort of very historically and inaccurately depicts the Scottish Wars of Independence in the 12th and 13th centuries. Characters like Robert the Bruce, who was at one point excommunicated for having murdered somebody in a church, I believe, and then was eventually restored to friendship with the church, who needed the church to intervene and to specifically sanction his claims to the throne of Scotland, who played key diplomatic roles in the negotiations between England and Scotland during those wars. And yet, in Braveheart, the only time clergy appear in any of the dynamics, there's no main clergy role, but sometimes they appear on the field of battle, giving kind of blessings to the belligerents. But other than that, the church is shamefully absent from the depictions of those historical events. Another movie I really like, and I should say I like Braveheart a lot, is The Last Samurai. There were missionaries, Catholic missionaries, who played a huge role in the sort of the colonization and the industrial development of Japan at that time. And yet, in the various political machinations and the conflicts that took place, they're conspicuously absent again. Or even a TV show like Downton Abbey, which is about, admittedly, Anglican England, but the characters in that era, religion would have played a very central role in their lives. They would have been people of prayer. They would have been church-going people. They would have had key relationships with clergy and bishops and things like that. And while, they do appear from time to time, they're backdrop at best, and even kind of annoying figures, squabbling over, church bureaucracy and formalities and marriages and things like that, or marriage ceremonies. But otherwise, these people don't seem to give any heed to the role of the church or the faith in their own lives. But I would argue that it's undeniable that the Catholic Church has been the most influential ingredient in shaping the civilization as our history has led up to this moment. And that's why I want to highlight one of the key things that is something that we could look to as sort of a prophecy that has been fulfilled, and really powerfully describes this era of history that we're living through. And yet, for all the people who want to comment on what's going on out there, and the political commentary and the philosophical and even the theological commentary that's out there, very few people are acknowledging that this teaching and our failure to heed it in the modern era is a main culprit in what has led to a lot of the deleterious effects that are conspicuously present in society today. And that's specifically the teachings of Paul VI in his encyclical Humanae Vitae. And why I want to focus in on it is because he made several predictions about what would happen if that teaching wasn't heeded, and it wasn't. And now we are reeling from the consequences of that without even really understanding why or what's contributing to the negative situations that we find ourselves in historically, politically, and culturally. So he made 4 or 5 predictions that I want to highlight that have now come true, and I would say make it worth revisiting the teachings of Humanae Vitae, which we remember most acutely for its refusal to permit artificial contraception, and a general sort of sketch about human sexuality as it's taught, or the ethics about that as they're defined by the Catholic Church. So the first prophetic prediction that he made, which has come true, is that there would be a broad breakdown of marriage because of infidelity, which would be encouraged and made much more accessible due to artificial contraception being made more available and even encouraged on a wide scale by both our culture, our advertising, and even our medical establishment. And of course, that has come true. It's undeniable that the rate of divorce has skyrocketed since the mid-20th century. The next is conflict between the sexes, which we see in a very profound and sort of heartbreaking way, especially among younger generations who seem to really struggle to pair off into romantic relationships, and then especially in the form of marriage, which we kind of need as a pillar, an institutional pillar of our civilization. And yet they're struggling to pair off in those ways. The sexual revolution and sexual immorality and contraception are all contributing to this, but yet we didn't see this effect quite as profoundly immediately, because the general hormonal magnetism of men and women had continued to ensure that men and women were still pairing off, even though the fidelity of those relationships was something that was severely impaired. But now we're at the point where they can't even pair off anymore. And the infidelity, the promiscuity, the sexual objectification, that contraception and the general ethics of the sexual revolution that it produced are the key culprits in producing this state of affairs. The next thing that he predicted was the loss of respect for women in general, but also especially by men. And of course, we've seen that the sexual objectification of women was something that they protested, but seemingly without any understanding of what the potential good would be during the era of the OnlyFans. So they recognized that there was this objectification and abuse that was taking place by men, especially in positions of power, but they didn't know why this was happening. They simply denounced it as, hey, don't do that's bad. But what was leading to men to think this way about women? And simultaneously, what was the alternative good that should be honored in this case? We don't really know. And so we continue to limp on. It's also led to sort of an internalized lack of respect for women by themselves towards themselves, which might account for the fact that something like 10 to 15% of young women today are creating content on OnlyFans, which, I'm no expert on OnlyFans, so I don't even. At first, I thought it was something that was used for people to create content and to get support for any sort of a variety of content. But now from what I understand, that's almost exclusively pornographic. So 10 to 15% of women in the age bracket from like 18 to 30 are almost exclusively producing pornographic content on the internet. How can this become the standard by which so many young people think that they can earn a living? And how can we continue to maintain that they actually have respect for themselves, or that men looking on would respect them for doing so? Another key thing that he predicted was a false sense of mastery over the body, that we can transform the body, we can medicate our natural fertility, and we can define what it means to be fertile or sexual in nature as to what depicts biological sex between men and women. And we see this probably most profoundly, yes, in the sterilization of our fertility, but also in concepts like transgenderism, where we've completely lost any grounding in the biological reality of what a man and a woman is based on their sexual fertility. We think that we can, it's so malleable, and that we are so dominant over our biological condition that we can simply change what is a biological man into a woman and vice versa, and that there's not going to be any significant consequence for doing so. The last prediction that he made was the abuse by government as they embraced these new concepts of contraception and sterility. We saw this probably most horrifically in states like China, where they had forced abortions and forced contraceptions and one-child policies and things like this, but also in the United States, where they embraced the funding of contraceptives through healthcare policies and healthcare programs, the funding of abortions, the funding of IVF now in the era of Donald Trump, such that this is so encouraged and so enthusiastically adopted by our culture and our legislators that we aren't reproducing as a culture anymore. And it's leading to the death of the traditional heritage groups that have shaped this country, such that we are so desperate to maintain our population and our economic output that is contingent upon that population growth, that we now have to import significant numbers of immigrants, which is severely affecting young people again in negative ways. Young people who are entering into the workforce, who need to get experience through remedial jobs and who need to enter into college programs, but yet now find themselves competing with significant population growth that isn't really natural to the kind of population growth you would expect if it was biologically natural, if it was hereditary. And so this is creating massive disruptions to our economic system, to our education system, and to the job market. And so while our educators, our intellectual elite, our legislators, our entertainment and tech industries are all dismissing the key influential role that the Catholic Church has always played, and specifically these teachings from Humanae Vitae and Paul VI and Casti Connubii before it, and the countless other warnings that the popes have given us as we enter into this modern age, we find ourselves, again, confused and bewildered by the circumstances and the consequences that we are living through, yet we're defined by pope after pope and theologian after theologian, that had we heeded their teachings and their warnings, we probably wouldn't find ourselves with the kinds of consequences that we are living through today. So if anybody has the appetite to actually look back at our history and reflect on the past 25 years and frankly the past 100 years prior to it, we might find solutions and antidotes within these humble and sort of docile teachings of popes all along the way, who are saying, if we go down this road, it's going to be bad for all of those who embrace these novel ideas and these novel experiments. And so I would invite us to reflect on those and to maybe hit the brakes or even turn around and try to revisit those junctures where we forged ahead bravely and courageously into this new world, and now are suffering the consequences for it. We all want freedom. Freedom to speak, to think, to worship. But what about freedom to govern ourselves? Because in the absence of effort, we become the sum of our appetites, which is what the world wants, because the more you succumb to your appetites, the easier you are to manipulate. But true freedom is the freedom to do God's will. Freedom is becoming the man that God created us to be, men of worship, sacrifice, and love. And to achieve that kind of freedom, sometimes we need an exodus from the world, which is why this January, I invite you to join tens of thousands of men embarking on the Exodus 90 Challenge, which is about growing deeper in your faith by training your body, your mind, and your soul through the power of asceticism in collaboration with a local brotherhood. Inspired by the Desert Fathers of the early church, it's helping tens of thousands of men from all around the world today. So if you're ready to take the first step, Download the Exodus 90 app today and invite a few friends to join you to form a local fraternity. Just go to exodus90.com/Brian. Again, that's exodus90.com/Brian. You can join a brotherhood from all around the world for the Exodus 90 challenge, which begins on Monday, January 5th, to see if it's time for your Exodus.